I first got my own trombone towards the end of my 8th grade year after having already played trumpet since 5th grade, and when I got fitted for a trombone, I also got fitted for a mouthpiece to go along with it, and the person at the music shop brought out several options for me to try. There was one that shined out to me above the rest, and while it was a really stupid choice for a beginner on trombone, I have to say, 8th grade me had pretty good taste. Let's talk about it. How's it going, everybody? It's your host Sam here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel. As per usual, I hope you're all doing well, and I appreciate you tuning in. Today, on Season 3 of the Scholastic Brass Special, we are once again talking about trombone mouthpieces. Let's start off with some context. The vast majority of trombone players, at least here in the United States, when they start off, be it in grade school, middle school, or whenever else, will start off on something like a Bach 11C or 12C mouthpiece. Those are two fairly common beginner sizes, and they're beginner sizes by virtue of being fairly small for the underdeveloped set of lips, even if certain professionals do use 11Cs and 12Cs well into their jazz careers. They're oftentimes considered beginner mouthpieces. And what's more is the vast majority of these trombone players starting on 11Cs and 12Cs will eventually graduate up to a 6.5 AL, which is a little bit wider, a little bit deeper, a little bit more open at the throat, and so on. Just in general, a higher volume mouthpiece producing a larger volume of tone. The vast majority of trombone players I knew in my high school used a 6.5 AL with no complaints and no desire to explore any further. But what if I told you high schoolers that there was another fairly similar Bach mouthpiece with a few small tweaks made to it that can really open up your classical or concert tone? Enter the Bach 5G. Yes, I started on a 5G, which is foolish, but that was the mouthpiece I liked when I tried all those out in 8th grade. I do believe I tried something like an 11C, a 7C maybe, a 6.5 AL, and the 5G. And I found that the 5G had the most pleasing tone and low range without really detracting from my high range. And in my 14-year-old brain, that was good enough, so I went with it. Now, I don't have the exact 5G that I started out on, but I do have two here next to me. I have one on a small shank, identical to the one I started on, that I purchased in 2019, actually to use on euphonium at the time, which was an interesting choice, but not the worst thing in the world. And then more recently, I acquired this Megatone large-shank 5G, and that I got from a friend. It's got, some cosmetic challenges, but it is nonetheless a very good fit for my Conn 88H. Now let's start with a discussion of the specs of the 5G by digging through the Bach mouthpiece manual. The first thing we'll note is the rim of the mouthpiece, the part that actually interfaces with your chops when you play, is described by Bach as being medium wide and semi-flat. I would say the flatness of the rim, as someone who prefers rounder rims, really isn't overwhelming. It's relatively similar territory to, maybe just slightly more rounded than the Schilke 51, and much more rounded than the Schilke 51C4, the 4 indicating a flatter rim contour. And it's certainly a lot rounder than most Dennis Wick mouthpieces, which tend towards much flatter rims. Then the inner diameter of the mouthpiece, measured across the cup as such at its widest point, is 25.5 millimeters, or just over an inch, since there are 25.4 millimeters in an inch. If you want a fun piece of Bach trivia, here's one for you. Any Bach mouthpiece with a 6.5 size designation is actually 25.4, or exactly 1 inch across the cup, which I think is pretty cool. The throat is the point of greatest resistance there. Vertically speaking, it's about there at the mouthpiece, and it is 0.276 inches, or just about exactly 7 millimeters in diameter, and that corresponds most closely to, although not exactly, a size J on the US drill chart if you prefer to use those measurements. If you're used to 6.5 AL type mouthpieces, you'll be more used to a size G throat, which is just a little bit tighter than that. And then the back bore on the other side of the mouthpiece, can't do much to inspect it visually, and you can't really quantify it super well either, but in Bach's catalog it is a number 429, which is fairly standard on their G series mouthpieces, and is once again a little bit more open than the 420 that you can expect to find on your 6.5 AL type mouthpieces. Furthermore, we have some options here. You can get the 5G, as alluded to, either on a small or a large shank, and you can get it in several different blanks. You've got the standard weight, you've got the Megatone weight, which adds a pretty substantial amount of mass to the mouthpiece. I can't compare these two directly, but there is about a 30 gram increase between This and a standard weight large-shank mouthpiece, about 30-35 grams maybe. And furthermore, there is the Artisan blank, which looks quite different from either of these. It's sort of a harkening back to the old-style Bach mouthpieces from the New York period in terms of visual design, and it's a really cool-looking thing. I just don't really feel like plunking down that sort of dough for a mouthpiece. And another thing worth noting is that the 5G isn't just a mouthpiece, but rather a whole class or family of mouthpieces in Bach's catalog. If we scroll a little farther down the table, we'll see that there are actually several variants on the 5G design, depending on your exact needs as a player. Going in alphabetical order, we start off with the 5G-B. Some people speculate that the B is for baritone, although I don't see a ton of reasoning for that necessarily. And the 5G-B is identical to its cousin, the 5G, in terms of all cup measurements, but where it differs is it has a rounder rim than the 5G does. Now, the 5G standard has enough roundness for me, but nonetheless, if you wanted to go rounder, the B variant exists. Next up, we have the 5GL, which is only available on a large shank, unlike the other variants, which are available on both small and large as you please. And the 5GL is considered to be a take on an old-style 5G. Something to note about Bach mouthpieces, and I would say trombone mouthpieces in general, is that they really grew in all dimensions over the years between the early 1900s and now, the 2000s. So when you hear old-style 5G, what should go off in your head is, hey, maybe the old style means it was a little bit more compact. And indeed, the 5GL seems to be slightly shallower than the 5G. It is notated as medium deep rather than deep as the 5G is. Then we have the 5GS, which is quite a fun mouthpiece. I own one on a small shank and I really like it. And that is markedly shallower than the 5G is. The S does indeed seem to stand for small or shallow. And it's actually contentiously a closer cousin of the 6.5AL than it really is of the 5G, but I think it gets the 5 designation because it seems to share a much more similar rim to the 5G than the 6.5. I really don't prefer the 6.5 rim contour, and so when I want that general sound or playability or feel throughout the range, I'll go with the 5GS instead. What's interesting about the 5GS, and the 5GS is going to have its own video, but I'll briefly mention it here, it has a smaller size G throat, which is 0.261 inches or 6.63 millimeters, as does, as far as I'm aware, the 6.5AL, and it has a similar backbore to the 6.5AL. It's marked 420, although it's supposedly modified, and I think they flared the end of it out a little bit just to make it a tiny bit more open than the 6.5AL's stock backbore. And I suppose worth mentioning is the fact that on a small shank there is also the no letter 5, but that, except for the rim contour, is a very different beast. It's got, a much smaller throat, a much shallower cup. It's not excessively shallow, but nonetheless, when we're talking about a deep symphonic cup like the G, the no-letter cup is quite shallow by comparison. That's more of an all-purpose jazz mouthpiece. You can use it for your ballad playing or your high-register playing alike. And I will at some point have a video coming out on Bach no-letter mouthpieces because they are a lot of fun. But like I said, it really doesn't share anything with the 5G besides the rim contour. With that being said, if you're the type of player to have a fairly sensitive set of lips and you need to maintain the same rim feel between your large bore symphonic and your small bore jazz trombones, it's not the worst idea to go for a 5G on a large shank and a 5 on a small shank if you really need to rip on small bore. I know what you're probably thinking, let's hear some demos already, and that we will in just a moment here. I recorded the same excerpts using these two 5Gs on my two trombones. Firstly, my small bore, a King 3BF Silver Sonic, typical paint peeler jazz horn, and my other trombone is very much your standard symphonic. It's a .547 bore Conn 88H with the copper bell and everything. So two very different trombones that actually end up sounding surprisingly similar, I think, with the 5G. I'll let you be the judge. As far as small shank mouthpieces go, I would say the Bach 5G is just about as classical as you can get, with the other contestant potentially edging it out for first place being the Schilke 51D, which is even a little bit deeper than the 5G is. But keep in mind, that is almost excessively deep for a small shank trombone. I've used a Schilke 51D a few times for small shank trombone and had a fine time with it, but it can be really taxing to play on. It's much more commonplace to find the 51D on euphonium, where the lesser impedance in the cup matches the horn a little bit better, but for small shank trombone, where you're expecting to have a little bit of resistance to lean up against, the 51D just feels a little bit too cavernous, whereas the 5G really does feel like it locks in really nicely with a lot of small bore trombones. And on large shank, I would say that the 5G is a really good classical mid-size. It's definitely bigger and more open and potentially a little bit more winding than the 6.5 AL, since it does have that larger throat and a little bit less impedance in the cup section. But nonetheless, it really doesn't inhibit any part of your range or any part of the tonal compass. I find that the 5G is the exact kind of mouthpiece that can have a really crisp and clear and commanding sound on principal trombone, especially up in the higher register, but you can honk all you want on second and third trombone down in the basement. And what's more is, if you really back off, you can get a very pleasing and dark sort of sound. Like I said, the 5G isn't even intolerable on euphonium, and that's a pretty good testament to it being a very tonally flexible sort of mouthpiece. And I've tested it, of course, through the whole range. Like I said, I started on the 5G for the fairly shallow reason that 8th grade me really liked to play pedal tones on the trombone. He couldn't do that on the trumpet, and so he wanted to do that as much as possible on the trombone. And when I tried out those mouthpieces, the 5G was by far the best on a small shank for getting the pedals out. And similarly, small or large shank, the pedals do bark. Out to your pedal F and beyond, if you've got those sort of notes, it's got them. The trigger register speaks really, really nicely, especially on the 88 with that 5G. But when I did some arranging for Gonzaga's brass quintet that I was playing trombone in and using the 5G on, I wrote myself some pretty nasty passages involving a lot of high endurance, high register type playing, and the 5G rose to the challenge very, very well. Much better than the 4G that I was using prior. The 4G I feel like fits my face a little bit better. I like that there's a little bit less resistance in the cup, even though it's got the same throat. And I love the way it responds in the mid and low registers. It's an absolute tank, and it can blow like a beast up high. But the thing is, if I desire a lighter sound and I'm doing a lot of strenuous high playing, yeah, I'm probably gonna choose the 5B. It's a little bit narrower, a little bit shallower actually than the 4G, even though they're both marked G for the cup. And it just feels a little bit more appropriate for principal or chamber ensemble playing. But like I mentioned, starting out on a 5G as a beginner trombone player is, for most people, not the best idea. There's a reason so many people start out on that 12C sort of size, and it's because the trombone mouthpiece is relatively large. Not so much as the tuba mouthpiece, of course, but getting started on trombone takes a good portion of your chops. And getting your chops to respond is a process that takes years to figure out how to do optimally, and slowly over those years you develop more strength, more consistency, and a wider sort of range of musculature in your lips. And that is why people tend to size up on mouthpieces as they develop as players, particularly if they start out at something like the age of 10 or 11, where even their lips aren't fully sized yet, muscle mass notwithstanding. So with that being said, I would really most recommend the 5G not to elementary or middle school players, but to the fairly strong high schooler or college student who is interested in classical or orchestral type work. I think that is the spot where it'll shine most. Obviously, you can use it in wind ensemble, and I guess if you're feeling really headstrong, you could use it in jazz, but definitely make sure that you have the chop strength to play on it, as in test out those different mouthpieces as 14-year-old me did, and pay attention to more than just the pedal tones. But let's not let this detract from the fact that, and I cannot overstate, I find the Bach 5G to be one of the most effective classical sizes for the high schooler player who's on a budget, thereby making it one of the best value choices in my opinion, and as a result, in spirit of Scholastic Brass Special, it takes home a nice, sizable Sam seal of approval. If you don't have the means to go spend a bunch of money on custom Doug Elliott parts, or get a fancy Greg Black, or try a bunch of crazy boutique makers out, you can be fairly certain that the Bach 5G will fit your needs at the very least until you figure out what works better for you, or until you have the means to try or buy some of these fancier type of mouthpieces. And to be honest, I don't have as much experience as some do with those fancy mouthpieces, but the Bach 5G has served my needs very well up to this point. I started out on it, I ended up on it. Shocker. And that'll just about put a bow on another Mouthpiece spotlight here on the Samuel Plays Brass channel. If you want to check out more of these, they'll be in the playlist in the top right corner in the card up there. If you enjoyed this video, which if you're still here I hope you did, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below. And one last favor, if you find that like about 7 out of every 8 viewers of this channel you happen to not be subscribed, no pressure or anything, but subscribe button's right down there. It's a small gesture with a huge impact on the channel moving forward as we put out more of these reviews, and it'll keep you up to date as they come out. Until next time, I appreciate you sticking around, and we'll see you on the flip side. That was kind of underwhelming. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.